To an on-location edition of the Andy Staples Show. I'm here with Mitch Sherman, our Nebraska beat writer at The Athletic. We are at the coaches convention.
It's great to be here.
Matt Rhule there's a wall between us and him, but he's in there with a bunch of other coaches right now.
It's a big meeting, big head coaches meeting. Matt Rhule brought his entire staff to Charlotte for AFCA this week, and those guys have been working the hallways and working the rooms and introducing themselves with the new red end polos on.
Oh yeah. This is a big deal when Nebraska changes coaches, and I realize that those of you who are not Nebraska fans are probably getting a little bit, okay, we'll believe it when we see it, and I think that's fair. But I also think it's really interesting to check in on where Matt Rhule is right now, because obviously very good in his last two stops in college football at Temple and at Baylor. It didn't work out with the Carolina Panthers, but this is his chance to do this at Nebraska, where I feel like the expectations are a little bit different now.
Yeah, this is not 2008 Bo Pelini coming in, one coach removed from the great Nebraska legacy that was left by Tom Osborne and then handed to Frank Solich. Mm-hmm. So you're now three more coaches removed from that and coming off the worst run that Nebraska's had in this 2-decade-long period that's been beneath expectations. So Scott Frost's 4 years produce, or 4+ years, produce 5 losing seasons.
Golly.
And then you go back even beyond that with Mike Riley having a losing season in 17. It's been 2016 since Nebraska simply made a bowl game. That does, I think, impact the way that this is viewed at the start with Matt Rhule. And in some ways and this is maybe a little counterintuitive, but there's more patience.
Right.
In light of the fact that it's been so long, there's now more patience and more of an understanding level of just how high he has to climb.
Yeah, and
far he has to climb.
I would imagine that season 1, if they even make a bowl game, that will be considered legitimate progress.
Well, you look at the blueprint and the way that this has worked for Matt Rhule and his stops at Temple and Baylor, and year 1 has been tearing it down to the studs. Yeah. And this was pre-transfer portal.
Baylor was way worse.
And Baylor had a situation that went way beyond football.
Yeah.
And we understand, he came into Baylor, they had one commit.
Right.
When he took over at Baylor.
Jalen Petrie, pretty good one.
Right. And it worked out, and that was and one guy who stuck with them through that Jim Grobe year.
Yep.
And this is, of course, after the Art Briles era. Different situation entirely. Yeah. And even with all of the dysfunction that occurred in the Scott Frost years and the uncertainty and the turnover and 2022 at Nebraska was just a strange football season, because you had a head coach who got fired 3 weeks into the year, a defensive coordinator fired the next week, completely changed regime. Just in everything was in limbo for a longer period of time than you normally see it. So in some ways that impacts what Matt Rhule has in front of him. And I think it impacts the expectations, as we talked about, but it doesn't put Nebraska in a place that Matt Rhule inherited at Baylor. Or, Temple was a little bit different story, and he tore that one down.
Yeah.
And
he was coming into a better situation at Temple. It's interesting now because the world of college football has changed completely since he left it, and he didn't leave it that long ago.
Yeah.
But the transfer rules have changed. NIL has come along. And it feels like both of those changes, if handled correctly, can benefit Nebraska.
Yeah, NIL, it was what's that? When Matt Rhule left college football to go to the NFL, it may have been mentioned in some court depositions about name, image, and likeness, but we had no inkling of what this was going to be.
Didn't
in
figure
2023.
The states were going to take over and pass all these laws, and now Nebraska can pay players.
The transfer stuff had started,
but
it was nowhere near.
Yep.
You look at December of 2022 and the comings and goings in the portal, and when he left in 19 to go to the NFL, it didn't resemble that.
Yeah.
So it's a new world, and he had a learning curve that he had to catch up to, and he put a lot of work in. His staff put a lot of work in the month of December and now into January in getting up to speed on that stuff. And we'll see these transition classes. We talked about this during the week here. Nebraska has had a number of transition classes over the past 2 decades that you can compare this one to, where you can look at the process and see the method with which it was put together.
Right.
It looks intriguing here what they've done in a month, but you never
little
really
the
know.
Bill Callahan situation where there's a 41-day search.
Yeah, this was a longer search, but the Bill Callahan search went into the next year. It covered 2 years, and he didn't get hired until January. He still had a month to put together a class, but it was very haphazard. And I think that tends to happen a lot in these transition periods.
Yeah.
You end up with a new coach and a new coaching staff who just throw together a class and get players in any way they can get them. And that's not really the way it went with Rhule in the month of December. He had a very he had a specific plan,
right,
geographically and with the players that he wanted, the type of players that he wanted to get, and they executed it. Now we'll see if it works.
They're hitting Texas hard, really, for the first time since they were in the Big 12.
Absolutely, it's going to be a huge priority for the staff when recruiting gets back going here in January, and that's basically now.
Yes,
as soon as this convention's over, his staff is going to be on the ground in Texas with a presence that Nebraska has not had since it joined the Big Ten. And it's not for a lack of trying. You always want to recruit Texas.
Right.
Nebraska's not geographically that detached from the state of Texas.
It certainly helps when there's a bunch of guys who worked at Baylor.
You got a ton of guys with Baylor roots, and then he's hiring a Texas high school football coach in Bob Wager from Arlington Martin, a legend in the state of Texas.
Which he did when he got to Baylor.
Right.
He hired Joe McGuire, who is currently the Texas Tech head coach and whose son has come to work for Matt Rhule in Nebraska.
23-year-old Garrett McGuire will be on staff as the wide receivers coach. Wager's going to coach the tight ends. This is a blueprint, again, much like we talked about with the way that he went about compiling a class in December, the way that he's compiled a coaching staff, it fits a blueprint that he instituted in his time at Baylor. Not just Joey McGuire, but he hired Sean Bell as an assistant coach at Baylor. The McGuire thing is really interesting, and he is. This is normally a guy who would have 5-6 years minimum left to work as a quality controller or a GA or an intern, and he's being pushed right into this role because Matt Rhule feels that he can go out and make a difference recruiting and make a difference working with players on the field at that receiver spot.
This staff is young in general, though, right? Younger than usual, and it reminds me a little bit of Jim Harbaugh overhauled his staff at Michigan, and it got significantly younger.
Yeah,
and coincidentally, or maybe not, that's when they started getting better. But it does seem like that's the goal here.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a correlation to draw there where youth is always going to produce winning, but I think the motivation behind what Harbaugh did. I think you need some
energy to recruit in this kind of environment.
Well, I think what Rhule has recognized in putting together his staff is that he's going to push these guys extremely hard. He wants them to work long hours in the office and out of the office in recruiting primarily, but of course, in the fall, that turns into game planning, and those hours are invested in a different way. And if you're hiring a bunch of guys in their 50s, and he has one in his staff, you
still need some of that too.
Yeah, you need some experience.
Yeah,
but if your staff is filled up with veterans, there's benefits to that. I don't know that the benefits necessarily fit the style that he wants to bring to this regime.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see how they go forth, because this first part did seem there was like a real plan of what they were going to take out of the transfer portal, where they were going to hit in terms of recruiting high schoolers. The first full cycle will tell us a little more. But to your point about the transition classes, this is something that Mike Riley, that Scott Frost, that Bill Callahan did not have the advantage of being able to get experienced players now. And the most interesting player that Nebraska took out of the portal has got to be Jeff Sims.
Yeah.
Former Georgia Tech quarterback. He's from Jacksonville, 6'4", 220. You saw flashes at Georgia Tech that he could be pretty good, but then they didn't protect him very well. What can he be at Nebraska? And, oh, by the way, Casey Thompson's still there.
I will say this about Jeff Sims, too, and what's so important before I get to what he can add to the Nebraska offense. Not only did they go get Jeff Sims, they got Ben Scott, who's not going to get the run.
Right.
Ben Scott will be Jeff Sims' center from Arizona.
That matters a lot.
A top offensive lineman who has experience at tackle and experience at center, played center this last year in the Pac-12 and was productive at that position. So you can't be a great quarterback anywhere, especially in the Big Ten in November, if you don't have the right guys blocking for you. Okay, Sims, Rhule believes that he's an NFL talent.
Yeah.
And Rhule has kept his eyes on Jeff Sims for the past several years. Rhule's successor at Temple was Jeff Collins.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff Collins went to Georgia Tech, recruited Jeff Sims. Rhule was interested in seeing how Collins did. They were there's connections, of course, there between those two coaches.
And everybody was watching the experiment at Georgia Tech as they tried to move away from the triple option into something more conventional now.
So on Saturdays, before Matt Rhule coached on Sundays, he took some time to watch college football, wanted to remain connected to the game. That's where he drafts his players. And Jeff Sims caught his eye. So the beginning of his first day at Nebraska, Jeff Sims goes into the transfer portal. And immediately it intrigues Matt Rhule. And he's on the phone with Collins, finding out, what he needs to know about Sims. And pretty soon he's in the fold at Nebraska. And then on signing day, this was revealing, December 21st, Rhule gets in front of the media to talk about his signing class. He gets asked about Jeff Sims. He's effusive in his praise. A question comes about Casey Thompson. The returning starter at Nebraska will be a sixth-year senior if he follows through with the decision to return into next fall. And it's much more mild-mannered in the answer. Now, Rhule doesn't know Casey Thompson.
I was going to say, so it sounds like a lot of my guy and not my guy.
There is some of that.
Yeah.
But we'll see. Casey is coming off shoulder surgery, and he was a warrior for Nebraska this year. I mean, kept getting up off the ground, and he didn't have we talk about Sims and what he needs with an offensive line. Casey Thompson did not have the luxury of playing behind a solid offensive line at Nebraska. So he took a beating, and he's the reason Nebraska remained in games, that Nebraska
and beat Iowa at the end of the season.
Right. Yeah. That Nebraska had enough left in the tank to beat Iowa on Black Friday.
It is amazing. And Casey Thompson's going to miss the spring because he's recovering from the
physically.
Injury. Yeah. But I will say, we've seen situations like this before. And the one I keep thinking of is Tennessee. Okay. Now, it's a little bit different because Hendon Hooker had transferred in from Virginia Tech, but he transferred in when Jeremy Pruitt was still the coach. So Jeremy Pruitt gets fired. Josh Heupel comes in. Like Casey Thompson, they recruit over Hendon Hooker. They go get Joe Milton from Michigan. And Milton wins the starting job, gets dinged in the Pittsburgh game. They put in Hendon Hooker, and the rest is history. So
see what happens.
If I'm Casey Thompson, I'm not giving up on this thing yet. Like, there's a chance it still works out.
Yeah, one of the interesting things with Casey Thompson is that he's and we'll see if he has that approach where he remains with the program if Jeff Sims takes control of this thing out of the spring. Casey Thompson is such a unique guy in college football in that not only did he earn his degree from Texas, he's earned his master's degree from Nebraska.
Oh, so he's a PhD candidate somewhere else.
I guess he's going for his doctorate as a sixth-year senior.
Brady White did that, the quarterback from Memphis who transferred from Arizona State. It's doable, but that does give him a lot of options. And it'll be fascinating to see what happens at the end of this spring, because there will be teams that are still looking for quarterbacks in the portal. So Casey Thompson, who has starting experience at Texas and Nebraska, if that's the route he goes, there'll be people there.
Now, Nebraska has 4 quarterbacks on its roster heading into the spring with starting experience at the Power 5 level. You have Sims and Thompson, who we've talked about. You have Logan Smothers, who's been a backup at Nebraska for 3 seasons and started in 2021 in the season finale against Iowa, played well, and has been loyal and has remained at Nebraska. This is a kid out of Alabama who, it's not like an in-state kid. Yeah. He wants his degree from Nebraska. He's set to get his degree this May. He could be on the market as a transfer option. And then there's Chubba Purdy, who has starting experience at Florida State and at Nebraska when Thompson was hurt last year.
Injury history and
struggles. Yeah. And hasn't proven himself to be that level of quarterback to this point, but the talent is there, and we know the family lineage is there.
The lineage is great because Big Bro did great at Iowa State and is killing in the NFL now. Right. So there seems to be a lot of optimism in Nebraska, and you and I talk about this all the time, the amount of sunshine pumping that goes on in the offseason in the Nebraska program. But for me, it feels a little different because we've seen Rhule do this twice at places where it should have been really hard to win the way he won, especially the situation he walked into at Baylor, where a couple of years later they're playing for the Big 12 championship. That is not easy to do. And Frost obviously was coming off an undefeated season, but he did inherit a pretty amazing roster that George O'Leary put together at UCF. Rhule had to rebuild the thing, and that feels like the difference to me. Because I catch myself being pretty optimistic about Nebraska's future as well. But it's hard because we've just not seen them succeed lately.
Yeah, it gives me a moment of pause when the optimism starts to rush in, and you think about, okay, he did this at Baylor, he did this at Temple, and I think, okay, what's the common thread? Well, you're in the state of Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Think about your recruiting base.
Yeah,
you're in the state of Pennsylvania, and
pretty good recruiting base there and up and down the Eastern Seaboard,
and in New Jersey. Think about the recruiting base. It's a different story at Nebraska. Now, I'm not going to get on the train and say there is not talent in Nebraska, because I think that's a narrative sometimes that gets overblown.
They've actually had a couple of good years.
Yeah, the state of Nebraska produced 13 Power 5 players in this 23 class. Nebraska got signed 8 of those players.
Yeah.
You're not going to build your entire program around that, but there is enough there to form a foundation.
Mm-hmm.
You can have 20 or 30 scholarship players from the state of Nebraska in your program, and that is the recipe to building a championship team in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Yeah.
You have to start at home. And a lot of times you'll have linemen, but now in recent years, there's been an influx
skill guys out of Omaha
receivers
and Lincoln as well.
Historically, there have been running backs from Omaha. So that has to be where he begins. Matt Rhule, in his first week on the job at Nebraska, didn't leave Lincoln. Didn't leave the state of Nebraska.
Yeah.
Got on a plane, went to Little Pierce, Nebraska, flew way out west to the Wyoming border to Scottsbluff, Nebraska, went to Omaha, hit all the high schools in Omaha, even the high schools that Scott Frost and his staff weren't going to. His first school visit was to Lincoln High School. So he understands the importance, much like he did at Texas, with a much, much larger incentive. He understands the importance at Nebraska in starting at home and in building things there. So that is, I think, reason to believe that he can duplicate the formula that he had at Baylor and at Temple. But as I said, there's also some pause there because the talent pool doesn't go as deep.
Right.
I will say, after he spent that weekend in the state of Nebraska, he went to Texas and went to Pennsylvania and exclusively for several days recruited those familiar areas and gathered commitments.
And I think Nebraska can be a national recruiting program with the foundation that you were talking about. You still have to have that. But, I think about in the old days, they did get guys from New Jersey. They got guys from California. I mean, I'm going way, way back, I realize, but
got a Heisman Trophy from
New Jersey.
Right.
Absolutely. So
got a number 1 overall draft pick from New Jersey.
Yes.
Irving Fryer. Yes.
So it is definitely possible. And I realize that Nebraska isn't the name that it used to be, but it's still a recognizable name. And I still feel like if they get players on campus, they're going to take it seriously.
Yeah, and that's what's going on. There's you talk about getting players on campus and how that will help tremendously in the recruiting area. This offseason, there's a big step being taken in that area, and that Nebraska is opening its $165 million new football complex. I think the last time that we talked, we were sitting in
Arizona. That's right. Yep.
And that thing was coming out of the ground, and it was, just a vision. Well, now it's a building.
Yeah.
And it opens in July, and the recruits who come in on visits at right now, they get hard hats and they go through that thing and they see where their weight room is going to be and they see where their training table is going to be. And I know everybody's got facilities and everybody's got buildings, and buildings don't win championships, but they do help impress kids when you get them on campus. So it's so important for Nebraska to get those guys, whether it's an official visit or an unofficial visit, just to come to Lincoln. And then, Matt Rhule's program is in the picture.
Well, the NIL thing is interesting as well, because I know I brought up Tennessee earlier, but I feel like Nebraska and Tennessee are actually pretty good comparisons to one another. Tennessee, obviously, a little better natural recruiting base in terms of who can drive to campus, but in terms of statewide passion for that university and that team, and if you are good there, you are beloved forever. Look at the Tennessee players and what they've been able to take advantage of from an NIL front. And I'm not talking about the recruits. I'm talking about the guys who are on the roster already. You know, David Ovens done great story, like Alante Taylor had all these deals, and Valus Jones and Cedric Tillman and Jalen Hyatt.
Yeah.
Imagine that at Nebraska. Imagine Nebraska is suddenly an 8-9 win team. What are the stars of that program getting?
Yeah, it's not a thought that it's not something I've put a huge amount of thought into until you just said that, because most of the focus on the collectives and on NIL has been with recruits, but it can't be ignored. You have to take care of your current roster, or they're going to end up in the portal.
Absolutely.
And Nebraska has certainly done that. I say I've not spent a ton of time thinking about it, but they have.
Well, that's what I was going to say. That seems like a fan base, an alumni base, a donor base that is willing to give wherever it feels like it needs to give. And Tennessee was very similar to that. Texas A&M's been very similar to that. Now, Texas A&M, a great example of that doesn't always work.
It has the support. Nebraska has the financial resources in its donor base to be able to be a player, I would say, at the top 10 to 15 program level, as far as the amount that is available for current players and prospects through NIL. It's what it doesn't want to do is try to get into a game with Ohio State where, okay, we're going to match them, because you're just not going
to. And also, I'm
Alabama.
not sure it's the wise to get into the bidding wars for the recruits.
Yeah.
Maybe to a certain extent. But at a certain point, you also have to be able to advertise, hey, my program can do this for you. And that's where I will say Ohio State, Georgia, Alabama have a significant advantage, because they don't have to offer as much up front, because they can say, look how many first rounders we make.
Or maybe if there's one specific recruit that you want to build your program around.
Yep.
Dylan Raiola.
I was going to say, who could that possibly be, Mitch? Let's tell, for the folks who don't follow recruiting that closely, tell them who Dylan Raiola is.
Right. This is the name that is on the minds of every Nebraska fan who follows recruiting, or actually, if you don't follow recruiting, I think Dylan Raiola is on the tip of your tongue.
How many centers produce quarterbacks? Because the Raiola name in Nebraska, Dominic Raiola, his numbers retired. He was a center, great all-time. Think about how many all-time great offensive linemen came through Nebraska, and he's one of the best ever.
Right. He's a Remington Award winner. Of course, that's a trophy that's named after another Nebraska
Dave
center.
Remington, exactly.
Yeah. So Dominic Raiola was at Nebraska 20 plus years ago. Longtime NFL player, and had a daughter who's a volleyball player at TCU. Then he had two sons. And his oldest son is Dylan Raiola, who is a rising senior or a junior at this moment at Chandler, Arizona High School in the Phoenix area. And Dominic has groomed his son to be a quarterback, and he is the number 1 rated player in the 2024 recruiting class, who just recently decommitted from Ohio State.
Funny how that works.
Not long after Matt Rhule took the job at Nebraska. So the thought here, and the dream of all Nebraska, is that Dylan Raiola signs with the Huskers in December of this year, and then comes in 2024, and they build around him. Now, look, he was at the national championship game this week in Los Angeles, watching Georgia, who is
recruiting him,
another suitor for him. So this is not a done deal.
Yeah.
If Dylan Raiola commits to Nebraska before spring practice begins, it's still not a done deal. Nowhere near a done deal.
Yep.
When he signs that letter of intent, you can breathe easily.
Well, and the fact that Georgia is recruiting him, I think it should be very telling, because Georgia recruited one quarterback in the class of 2023, Arch Manning, didn't get him. And then Kirby Smart gets asked about quarterback recruiting, and goes, there's plenty in the portal, which if you're Kirby Smart, you can say that, because now they like Carson Beck. They like Brock Vandegrift. They like Gunnar Stockton. They have 3 very highly touted quarterbacks on their roster now.
We got to see Beck
we got to see Carson Beck for a quarter of the national title game. Exactly. But let's say they didn't like them. You know what they could do? They could hang out a sign that says, who wants to throw to all these guys? And everybody would jump in the portal.
Yeah. Right. That's amazing that Georgia has that luxury, and that Alabama or USC has that luxury.
But it's interesting, because that seems to be who they've targeted in 2024.
Oh, yeah.
There may be some others, but they seem to be very focused on Dylan Raiola, which Nebraska, even with the sentimental ties, that is a lot to overcome.
Right. It's deeper than just a sentimental tie, a former player. Dylan Raiola's uncle is Nebraska's offensive line
That's exactly
coach.
Right.
Dylan Raiola's family, Dominic's family, his father, his mother, Dylan's younger brother, Dayton, by the way, who has an offer from Nebraska.
Oh,
also,
of course.
He was a freshman this last year.
You got to offer the brother. Come on.
At Chandler. They come to Nebraska games often, and the Raiolas, they travel around. They get around.
Yeah.
They, he's a retired NFL player.
Yeah.
He can take his family places.
What a life.
So when they come to Lincoln and they get their red on, and we saw them even as he was committed to Ohio State last year, we continued to see the Raiolas show up, and they'd be on the field before the game in their red and taking pictures with everybody. And of course, everyone knows who they are because Dominic, he looks the same. He looks like some offensive linemen, they look different after they retire.
He looks like he could play right now.
Dominic looks like he could have been the Nebraska center or the Detroit Lions center this last season. So their passion, that family's passion for the University of Nebraska, it runs deep. And I think they're going to need Nebraska and Matt Rhule and his staff are going to need to tap into every bit of that passion in order to get him to Lincoln when Georgia is calling.
Right. And others. I mean, he did decommit from Ohio State. I don't think they quit. So
why would you?
Yeah, exactly. But that's the pool you got to swim in. And when you have it in like they do, this is your chance.
And we started this conversation by talking about NIL and how Nebraska doesn't want to get into the same waters of NIL with the programs that are bidding for Dylan Raiola.
If it's that one player,
if you can get the one guy, then what he presents, the attraction of being a recruit in the 2024 class with Dylan Raiola as the headliner is just as valuable. Oh, maybe more valuable.
With Arch Manning when he committed to Texas. I mean, they piled it. That Pied Piper effect was crazy.
Right. And that's the thought. That's the hope. That's the, the plan for Rhule and his staff in this next recruiting cycle is to be able to build around a guy like that.
So let's talk about the future at Nebraska because, Matt Rhule planning for, he hopes a years and years and years long tenure there. Things are changing. The Big Ten is probably going to be a divisionless place.
It will be
in the next couple of years. So where does Nebraska stack up now? And where realistically do you think is their ceiling?
Sure. We need to get Scott Docterman on here to talk about schedules.
Oh, yeah.
Because
trust me, it's on the schedule.
I've
scheduled Scott Docterman to talk about schedules.
Yes. If you know Scott, you know exactly what we're talking
exactly.
about. But the pod systems and who is Nebraska going to play. I will call Scott early in this offseason in planning out.
Iowa's the one certainty it feels like.
Yeah, I think another certainty is that they're going to get paired up with one of these California teams when things go.
Well, because the brand power. Imagine the brand power of an annual USC Nebraska game.
Right, or Nebraska plays USC or UCLA every year, or Nebraska goes to LA every year.
I don't think they'd mind that either.
No, it'd be fine. Yeah. I mean, look, they want to recruit in California. I mean, they want to recruit in Nebraska and Texas and Pennsylvania and Florida, Georgia, in New Jersey.
Yeah,
and they want to get to California. That's Tony White. Tony White, the Nebraska defensive coordinator. Yep. He played at UCLA. That's where he met Matt Rhule, was at UCLA. Then he coached at San Diego State for Rocky Long. So Tony White is their connection to the West Coast. And having USC and UCLA come into the league in 2024, that opens doors for him to go out there as the defensive coordinator and get defensive talent and find offensive players. Yep. They've had a history of so many great players from that state. So Nebraska wants to be in California, and I think it will be playing games at the Rose Bowl and at the Coliseum. So that's great. They've played those teams traditionally in the non-conference. They've played those teams in bowl games. It's a fit for Nebraska, I think, as much or more, maybe you tell me, than with any of the teams.
Oh, I definitely think so. And I'm just thinking logo matchups, just as a TV viewer. If I see that N and Tommy Trojan or that N and that script UCLA, I'm like, ooh,
otherwise,
I want to see that.
Yeah. Otherwise, the future's kind of murky as far as who they're going to play.
It felt like they liked having him play Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. They seem to like having him play Ohio State. Mm-hmm. That's another big logo matchup. But
yes, the Big Ten did like the Nebraska-Ohio State matchup, as Nebraska fans are well aware.
Yeah, want nothing to do with it. Yeah, exactly. Can we please not play them every year? Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. Where do you think, because we know where the top tier is Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State. Mm-hmm. Michigan State wants to get into that next tier. I think the fact that Luke Fickell took the Wisconsin job suggests that he believes they can be either in that next tier or that top tier.
It tells me that Wisconsin wants to get into that top tier.
They want to be.
I wouldn't have necessarily said it a year ago.
Yeah. No, they're willing to spend. They're willing to put the resources in. So Nebraska is up against that. Now, the good thing about Nebraska, they've always been willing to put in resources. They've always been. They just haven't made the best choices.
Yeah. The pecking order in the Big Ten over the next 5 years and how that hashes out is going to be so interesting to watch as the two California teams come in, as Wisconsin rebrands itself with Luke Fickell and whatever this offense
Iowa's
is.
still going to be solid to good to very good some years.
Iowa's heading toward change.
Right.
Iowa has the clock is ticking.
Right.
As much as
Kirk Ferentz is the longest tenured coach in America at this point. So you
don't generally stay the longest tenured coach in America for a decade.
Correctly.
That's a title that's
exactly right.
Usually relinquished in a fairly
he got
short
it when
period
Bob
of time.
Stoops retired, which was, by the way, June 2017.
This is like the oldest living person in the world. How when you're the oldest
you
living person in the world, you don't have that title for all that long. So Iowa's headed toward some kind of a redefining of its program in the next 5 years also. And then, as I said, you got the change at Nebraska, you got the change at Wisconsin. We'll see what happens at Michigan.
Yeah.
It's an interesting.
By the time this podcast runs, right? we're worrying about Michigan right now. So, yeah, it does feel like this is an opportunity for Nebraska to kind of rebrand itself, to be a different program than it's been for the last, I guess, since Bo Pelini was fired.
Right. And so the direction that Matt Rhule wants to take it is for Nebraska to define itself as a physical, punch you in the face kind of program.
Which is what it was when they fired Bo Pelini.
And we wonder, is Wisconsin moving away from that? I don't know. They would say no. Well,
I've heard Phil Longo talk, and he says they're not going to change they're still going to rely on the run game.
But what does he do?
I look at Javonte Williams and Michael Carter when they were both at North Carolina, and they ran a ton. So he does seem willing to run when he has the horses to do it. You better do that at Wisconsin. You're not going to last long.
You have to in Madison. That's just there's not another formula for success in Madison or in Minneapolis or in Iowa City.
I've heard Rhule talk about that in one of your stories where he talked about prepare for the environment you play in. And he said he got that from Bill Belichick.
Yeah. And Michael Lombardi.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So the former GM.
Yes. Hey, I mean, Belichick would understand somebody who's coached in elements for his entire
you got to
career.
play in Buffalo every year. Sometimes you have to play in Miami in September. And so it's very different.
So there's a Rhule Belichick connection to go on a quick tangent here.
Oh, yeah.
Bill Belichick connected with Matt Rhule on some level when Rhule was at Temple. When Matt Rhule was up for the Nebraska job, the Nebraska president, University of Nebraska system president, Ted Carter, who was intimately involved in the search process with Trev Alberts, the athletic director, the person administratively between the two of them, Nebraska's chancellor, Ronnie Green, is retiring. So Carter took the lead from an administrative standpoint in helping select this coach. He's a Navy guy. He's an admiral. He was the superintendent of the Naval Academy. So he has a personal relationship with Bill Belichick, who recommended Matt Rhule to Ted Carter. So Trev Alberts had all of his feelings and suspicions and connection with Matt Rhule on a personal level. And then Ted Carter, the school president, Trev's boss, chimes in with the Bill Belichick recommendation, which I'm not saying it sealed the deal or made the difference or anything like that,
hurt.
But it absolutely didn't hurt. So Belichick has told Rhule to, prepare to play in the environment that you're in. Yes. And it sounds obvious, but there have been coaches at Nebraska and other places in northern environments who haven't taken that advice historically.
Well, we're going to find out, because Matt Rhule is in a shockingly new environment. The world has changed completely since he left college football. He's got to adjust on the fly, and he's got a big job. Mitch Sherman, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.